April 1945. A Soviet checkpoint, 50 miles east of Berlin. Russian sentries watched through binoculars as American tanks rolled to a stop at the Elbe River. But they weren't looking at just any American unit. They were staring at the spearhead of George Patton's Third Army. And according to declassified Soviet intelligence reports, Moscow had given explicit orders: do not provoke Patton. Monitor his every move. The question wasn't whether the Germans feared him. Everyone knew they did. The real question was, why did America's own ally want him on a leash? The spring of 1945 should have been a time of celebration. Nazi Germany was collapsing. The Third Reich, once seemingly invincible, was now a shattered empire being squeezed from both sides. From the east, the Red Army bulldozed through Poland and into the German heartland with overwhelming force. From the west, American, British, and Canadian forces pressed forward after the successful D-Day invasion. Victory in Europe was no longer a question of if, but when. Yet beneath the surface of this grand alliance, a darker current was already flowing. Stalin and his generals looked west with suspicion. Churchill whispered warnings about an Iron Curtain descending across Europe. And in the middle of this powder keg sat one man who absolutely terrified Soviet high command. General George S. Patton Jr.'s silver-starred helmet, ivory-handled revolvers, a voice that could strip paint off a tank. He wasn't just a commander. He was a force of nature wrapped in military doctrine. While other Allied generals measured their advances in careful, methodical movements, Patton's Third Army moved like a lit fuse racing toward an explosion. In less than a year, his forces had torn through France, smashed into Germany, and liberated more territory than any other Allied army in the European theater. His tactics were aggressive, borderline reckless, and devastatingly effective. But it wasn't just his success on the battlefield that made the Soviets nervous. It was what he represented, and more importantly, what he wanted to do next. To understand why Moscow lost sleep over Patton, you have to understand the man himself. Born into a military family, Patton believed he was destined for greatness. Not hoped, believed. He claimed to have visions of past lives where he fought as a Roman legionnaire, a knight in the Crusades, a Napoleonic cavalry officer. Whether you think that's inspirational or insane doesn't matter. What mattered was that Patton genuinely saw himself as a warrior prophet born to lead armies into history. And by 1945, he had the track record to back up the ego. North Africa, 1943. Patton took command of a demoralized American force that had just been humiliated at Kasserine Pass. Within months, he transformed them into a disciplined war machine that helped push Rommel's Afrika Korps out of Tunisia. Sicily, summer of 1943. While British Field Marshal Montgomery carefully planned every move, Patton's 7th Army raced across the island in a lightning campaign, reaching Messina first and beating Monty in what became a personal rivalry. But it was in France where Patton truly became a legend. And a problem. August 1944. Operation Cobra had just broken the German lines in Normandy. While the breakout was planned as a steady, coordinated advance, Patton had other ideas. His Third Army exploded out of the Cotentin Peninsula like a cavalry charge. Tank columns rolled day and night. Supply lines stretched to the breaking point. His own superiors begged him to slow down. Patton's response: "We're not interested in holding anything except the enemy's balls. We're going to kick him in the ass and make him wish he'd never been born." And that's exactly what he did. Within weeks, Patton's army had covered more ground than anyone thought possible. Le Mans, Chartres, Orleans. Towns fell so fast German commanders didn't even know they'd lost them until American tanks were in the streets. The Third Army liberated Paris ahead of schedule, crossed the Seine, and kept pushing east. It was a masterclass in mobile warfare, the kind of relentless offensive momentum that hadn't been seen since Germany's own Blitzkrieg in 1940. Except now, it was being used against them, and the Soviets were watching. Very carefully. Stalin wasn't stupid. He knew the war in Europe was ending. The real question was what came after. Eastern Europe was already under Red Army occupation. Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary. Soviet forces controlled them all. Stalin intended to keep it that way. His plan was to create a buffer zone of communist puppet states between the Soviet Union and the West, ensuring that Russia would never again face invasion from Europe. But there was a problem. An American general who didn't seem to understand the meaning of the word stop. By early 1945, Patton's Third Army was deep inside Germany, and he was moving faster than anyone expected. While Supreme Commander Eisenhower and the other Allied leaders carefully coordinated their advance with political considerations in mind, Patton saw only enemy territory to conquer. He didn't care about occupation zones or post-war politics. He cared about Berlin, and he wanted to get there first. Here's where it gets dangerous. Berlin wasn't just a city. It was a symbol. Whoever captured the Nazi capital would claim victory over Hitler. The Soviets knew this. They'd spent millions of lives pushing west, and Stalin wanted Berlin as a prize for Soviet blood. It was agreed among the Allies that the Red Army would take the city. Eisenhower had even sent a message to Stalin confirming that American forces would halt at the Elbe River, about 60 miles west of Berlin, and let the Soviets finish the job. But Patton? He thought that was the stupidest decision he'd ever heard. "We're going to have to fight them sooner or later," Patton said privately to his staff. "Why not do it now while our army is intact, and we can kick the Red Army back into Russia? We can do it easily." He wasn't joking. Patton genuinely believed the Soviet Union was the next enemy. He saw Stalin as a dictator no better than Hitler, and he viewed the Red Army as a horde that had simply replaced one tyranny with another. In his mind, the smart move was to pivot immediately after defeating Germany and drive the Soviets out of Eastern Europe before they could dig in. Finish the job. Win the real war. Now imagine you're a Soviet general and you're reading intelligence reports about this American commander, a man who moves faster than anyone else, a man whose army has repeatedly humiliated German forces, a man who openly talks about fighting the Red Army next, and his forces are less than 100 miles from Berlin, sitting on the edge of Soviet-occupied territory. Would you be nervous? Moscow was more than nervous. They were actively preparing for the possibility that Patton might go rogue. Declassified documents reveal that Soviet commanders in Germany received specific instructions regarding the Third Army. Increase surveillance. Report all movements. Avoid confrontation, but be ready to respond with force if Patton's units crossed into Soviet zones. Red Army officers were told to treat Patton's forces differently than other American units. Not as allies, as potential threats. The Soviets even repositioned tank divisions and artillery units to counter a possible American thrust toward Berlin. They were preparing for war with their own ally. And the scary part? They had good reason. April 1945, Patton's forces reached the Elbe River. Across the water, Soviet troops waited. This was the agreed-upon stopping point, the boundary between the American and Soviet advance. Patton was ordered to halt and wait. But in true Patton fashion, he pushed the limits. His reconnaissance units crossed the river. Patrols made contact with Soviet forces. There were tense standoffs, moments where American and Soviet soldiers stared at each other across barrels, wondering if their next war was about to start right there. Patton wanted to keep going. He argued with Eisenhower. He raged in private, but he was leashed. Political realities overruled battlefield ambitions. What Patton didn't fully grasp or didn't care about was that starting a war with the Soviet Union in 1945 would have been catastrophic. The Red Army outnumbered Western forces in Europe significantly. The Soviets had over 12 million men under arms on the Eastern Front alone. America was war-weary. The public wanted soldiers home, and there was still an ongoing war against Japan in the Pacific. A conflict with the USSR would have meant World War III before World War II even ended. It was madness. But that's what made Patton so dangerous in Soviet eyes. He was mad enough to actually try. Meanwhile, Soviet intelligence was doing more than just watching. They were collecting reports on Patton's health, his statements, his relationships with other commanders, psychological profiles. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, kept detailed files on all major Allied leaders, but Patton's was special. He was categorized as unpredictable and ideologically hostile. One report described him as a fascist sympathizer with ambitions to continue the war against the Soviet state. That wasn't entirely fair. Patton hated Nazis, but his anti-communist rhetoric was so extreme that Soviet analysts genuinely believed he might stage some kind of military coup or unauthorized offensive. And then, in a twist that fed every Soviet paranoia, Patton did something that made Stalin's blood run cold. After Germany surrendered in May 1945, Patton was placed in charge of occupied Bavaria. His job was to denazify the region and help establish a new civilian government. But Patton, being Patton, saw things differently. He started making statements that got him into serious trouble. He told reporters that the Nazi Party was just like a Democratic or Republican election fight. He argued that former Nazi officials should be kept in administrative positions because they were the only ones who knew how to run things. He even suggested that Germans should be rearmed to help defend against the Soviets. Eisenhower was furious. The press tore him apart. And in Moscow, Stalin saw confirmation of what he already suspected. Patton wasn't just a rogue general. He was trying to rebuild a German military force to use against the Soviet Union. Whether that was true or not didn't matter. Perception was reality. And the perception was that America's most aggressive general wanted to team up with former Nazis and march east. It was, from a Soviet perspective, their worst nightmare coming true. What happened next changed everything. In September 1945, Eisenhower removed Patton from command of the Third Army. Officially, it was because of his comments about denazification. Unofficially, it was because Patton had become a political liability and a genuine threat to Allied unity. He was reassigned to command the 15th Army, a paper unit with no real combat role. It was a humiliation. The greatest battlefield commander of the war sidelined, and the Soviets breathed a sigh of relief. But the story doesn't end there. On December 9, 1945, Patton was riding in a staff car near Mannheim, Germany, when his vehicle collided with a truck. The crash wasn't severe. No one else was seriously hurt. But Patton suffered a severe neck injury that paralyzed him from the neck down. 12 days later, he died from a pulmonary embolism. He was 60 years old. The warrior who had survived 2 world wars, multiple combat actions, and countless near-death experiences died in a freak accident during peacetime. Or did he? Conspiracy theories swirled immediately. Some claimed the Soviets assassinated him. Others suggested the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, had him killed to prevent him from going public with his plans to fight the USSR. There's no credible evidence for either theory, but the timing was so convenient that the rumors have persisted for decades. What we do know is that Soviet intelligence noted his death with what one historian described as barely concealed relief. Internal NKVD documents referred to Patton's death as removing a significant obstacle to post-war stability. That's Soviet speak for, we're glad he's gone. But why did the Soviets fear Patton so much? Why not other Allied generals? Montgomery was skilled. Eisenhower was supreme commander. Bradley was highly competent. But none of them scared Moscow the way Patton did. The answer comes down to 3 things: speed, aggression, and ideology. Patton's speed was unmatched. Soviet commanders knew from their own experience that mobility was everything in modern warfare. They'd used it to devastating effect against the Germans. And they recognized that Patton understood it better than any Western general. His ability to move large armored formations over vast distances at incredible speed meant he could strike deep into Soviet-held territory before they could react. That made him unpredictable. And unpredictability in a military opponent is terrifying. His aggression was equally troubling. Soviet doctrine relied on overwhelming force and absorbing enemy attacks before counterattacking. But Patton didn't fight that way. He attacked relentlessly, never giving the enemy time to regroup or fortify. He believed the best defense was a violent, unrelenting offense. That style of warfare was the worst possible matchup against Soviet strategy. Because if Patton started a fight, he wouldn't stop until he was deep behind enemy lines. And by then, it would be too late to contain him. But the real reason the Soviets feared Patton was ideological. He wasn't just a general. He was a true believer. He genuinely thought communism was evil, that the Soviet Union was a threat to civilization, and that war with Stalin was inevitable. Most Allied leaders saw the Soviets as difficult partners, but partners nonetheless. Patton saw them as the enemy, and that made him willing to do what others wouldn't even consider. He would have started World War III if given the chance. Not out of recklessness, out of conviction. Looking back, history proved Patton partially right. The Cold War did happen. The Iron Curtain did fall across Europe. Eastern Europe did suffer under Soviet occupation for nearly half a century. And many historians have debated the what-if scenario. What if Eisenhower had let Patton take Berlin? What if the Western Allies had pushed the Soviets back in 1945? Would it have prevented decades of Cold War tension? Or would it have resulted in a catastrophic war that destroyed Europe entirely? We'll never know. What we do know is that Patton's Third Army earned a reputation as one of the most formidable fighting forces in military history. In less than a year of combat, they liberated over 80,000 square miles of territory, captured more than 1.2 million enemy soldiers, and suffered fewer casualties relative to ground gain than any other Allied army. They moved faster, hit harder, and scared the enemy more than anyone else. And that enemy included not just the Germans, but the Soviets too. The fear Moscow had of Patton wasn't paranoia. It was recognition. They saw in him the same kind of relentless warrior spirit that their own commanders admired. The same drive that had pushed the Red Army from Stalingrad to Berlin. Except this time, it was pointed at them. And unlike the fractured, desperate Germans they'd been fighting, Patton commanded a fresh, well-supplied, technologically superior army that hadn't been bled white by years of war. If he came east, it wouldn't be a siege. It would be a storm. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov, one of the greatest military minds of the war, met Patton briefly in Berlin after the German surrender. They were polite, professional, but according to witnesses, Zhukov studied Patton carefully, watched how he moved, how he talked. Later, Zhukov reportedly told his staff, "That one is dangerous. He does not think like a staff officer. He thinks like a conqueror." Coming from Zhukov, the man who had led the defense of Moscow and the assault on Berlin, that was the highest compliment and the gravest warning. In the end, Patton's greatest battle was never fought. The clash between the Third Army and the Red Army remained a hypothetical, a nightmare scenario that lived only in classified reports and contingency plans. But the fact that it was even considered, that both sides prepared for it, tells you everything about the man. George Patton wasn't just a general. He was a weapon. And the Soviets knew that weapons don't care about politics. They only care about targets. Some battles decide wars. Others decide the fate of empires. But the battle that never happened between Patton's Third Army and Stalin's Red Army, that might have decided the entire future of the world. What do you think? Could Patton have actually pulled it off? Or would it have been the greatest disaster in military history?